They said he was too unstable to raise his own daughter, but 3 nights later, his dog uncovered something buried beneath the cabin floor that would change everything. Daniel Mercer didn't lose custody because he stopped loving his daughter. He lost it because the war followed him home. When the judge's gavel fell in Cheyenne, it didn't just end a case. It silenced a father. So he drove 8 hours into the Wyoming mountains, to a cabin no one wanted, and a silence no one could survive alone. But on the 3rd night, while the storm howled outside, his German shepherd refused to sleep. And what the dog uncovered beneath the wooden floor wasn't just a secret. It was proof that someone had been preparing for this storm all along. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The courtroom in Cheyenne, Wyoming, felt smaller than Daniel Mercer remembered. Not physically. The ceilings were still high. The flags still stood in their polished brass holders. The state seal still hung heavy behind the judge's bench. But the air felt tight, compressed, like the walls had leaned inward overnight. Daniel stood beside his attorney, hands loosely clasped in front of him. He wore the only suit he owned, pressed the night before in a motel room that smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. The collar tugged slightly at his neck, but he didn't adjust it. He didn't move at all. At his feet sat Atlas. The German shepherd was perfectly still, his dark coat brushed, his posture alert but calm. A red service vest rested across his broad back. His ears twitched once when a chair scraped against the floor behind them. But he did not break position. He had learned long ago how to wait through tension. Daniel had too. Across the aisle, Karen Whitmore sat with her husband's hand resting confidently over hers. She wore soft gray and pearl earrings, her hair styled in careful waves. Her expression wasn't cruel. It wasn't triumphant. It was certain. Daniel kept his eyes forward. When the judge began to speak, the words came measured and even, like snowfall, steady, controlled, impossible to stop once it began. After reviewing the submitted psychological evaluations, employment history, and testimony presented, the court finds that primary custody of the minor child, Emily Mercer, shall remain with her mother. The words hung there. Remain. As if Daniel had never truly held it. The judge continued, voice calm and almost gentle. Mr. But Mercer's documented struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder, though treated, indicate ongoing emotional instability. The court believes consistency is in the best interest of the child. Emotional instability. Daniel heard the phrase clearly. It did not sting the way it might have months ago. It landed somewhere deeper, somewhere numb. Atlas shifted slightly and leaned his shoulder against Daniel's calf. The judge went on outlining visitation terms, structured weekends, monitored adjustments, reevaluation in 12 months, legal language, procedural language, words designed to sound balanced. Daniel stared at a faint scratch in the wooden railing in front of him. In his peripheral vision, he saw Emily turn in her seat. She was 9 years old, small for her age, and her brown hair pulled into a loose braid that Karen had done that morning. Emily's fingers twisted the hem of her sweater as if she were trying to unknot something invisible. When the judge struck the gavel, the sound echoed sharper than it should have. It wasn't loud. It just lingered. Court was adjourned. People began to move. Papers shuffled. Chairs slid back. A cough somewhere in the rear. Daniel didn't. He remained standing exactly where he was. Atlas slowly rose, pressing closer to his side. Then he felt it. A small tug on his jacket sleeve. He looked down. Emily stood there now, having slipped free from the row of seats. Her eyes were red, not from loud sobbing, but from the quiet kind that burns. "Dad?" she asked softly. Her voice cracked on the second letter. Daniel crouched down in front of her. The motion was controlled, deliberate. His knees did not shake. His hands did not tremble. But inside, something folded in on itself. "Did I do something wrong?" Emily whispered. The question was barely audible, but it struck harder than the gavel had. Daniel's throat tightened. For half a second, just half, a flash of something violent and chaotic surged in his chest. Not anger at her. Never that. Anger at himself. At rooms like this. At words like, unstable. He swallowed it. He had learned how to do that overseas. "No," he said evenly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Emily studied his face, searching for cracks. He gave her none. Atlas stepped forward gently and nudged Emily's hand with his nose. She managed a small, watery smile and buried her fingers into the thick fur behind his ears. "I'll see you this weekend?" she asked. "Oh, yes." The word felt both fragile and unbreakable at the same time. Karen approached, heels clicking softly against the courtroom floor. "Emily, sweetheart, we need to go." Daniel stood back up. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask for reconsideration. He simply watched as his daughter walked back across the aisle. She turned once before reaching the door. Daniel raised his hand slightly. A signal. Not goodbye. Just steady. The doors closed. And just like that, the room seemed to empty of oxygen. His attorney said something beside him, about appeal options, about timing, about strategy. Daniel nodded at the appropriate pauses. He heard none of it. The hum of the fluorescent lights above him began to sound distant. A faint ringing crept into his ears. Somewhere deep in his mind, another sound layered over it. Rotor blades. Fast. Closing in. He blinked once. The courtroom came back into focus. Atlas pressed firmly against his leg now, grounding him. Daniel inhaled slowly through his nose. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 seconds out. The technique had been taught to him by a VA therapist in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. He used it now. The ringing faded. The imaginary rotor blades dissolved into silence. "Danny?" his attorney said carefully. "I'm good," Daniel replied. His voice was steady. Too steady. Outside, the Wyoming wind cut sharp across the courthouse steps. The sky was wide and pale, stretched endless over the plains. Karen's SUV pulled away first. Daniel stood at the top of the steps, Atlas sitting beside him, watching until the vehicle disappeared into traffic. But he did not wave this time. He felt something unusual in his chest. Not rage, not despair. Absence. As if someone had flipped a switch inside him and dimmed the lights. Atlas looked up at him, amber eyes searching. Daniel reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. "I'm fine," he said quietly. The wind carried the words away before they could settle. Atlas did not look convinced. For a long moment, Daniel stood there in the cold, unmoving. Cars passed. People walked by. The world continued at its ordinary pace. Inside him, everything had gone silent. And sometimes, for a man who had survived war, silence was the most dangerous thing of all. Daniel stood on the courthouse steps a few seconds longer than necessary, the Wyoming wind cutting through the thin wool of his suit. Atlas stayed close, pressing his weight against Daniel's leg as if anchoring him to the concrete. Most men in that position might have shouted. Some might have cried. A few might have broken. Daniel did none of those things. He simply walked down the steps, one measured step at a time, like he was exiting a briefing room instead of a courtroom. By the time he reached his truck, a faded blue Ford with a cracked dashboard and a faint scent of motor oil, his face had settled into something neutral. Not calm, not defeated, just blank. He opened the passenger door for Atlas first. "Up," he said quietly. The dog climbed in without hesitation, circling once before settling into position. Atlas did not lie down. He sat upright, eyes alert, watching Daniel with the same steady focus he once used in desert compounds overseas. Daniel slid behind the wheel, yet he did not start the engine right away. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. 44 years old, short hair graying at the temples, lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before Afghanistan, the faint scar above his eyebrow that no one in court had asked about. Emotional instability. He turned the key. The engine coughed once, then came to life. They left Cheyenne without music, without radio, without a destination spoken aloud. 8 hours north lay the Wind River Mountains, a cabin Daniel hadn't seen in nearly a decade, his father's place. By late afternoon, the highway thinned. Towns grew smaller. Gas stations appeared fewer and farther between. The plains gave way to rising land, then pine-covered slopes dusted in early winter snow. The world became wider, quieter. Daniel rolled down the window slightly, letting cold air flood into the truck. He preferred cold. Cold was clean, predictable. Atlas shifted as they climbed higher into the mountains, his ears flicking toward the sounds of gravel under the tires when Daniel finally turned onto an old forestry road. The sign at the turnoff had long since faded. No phone service, no streetlights, no neighbors within miles. The road narrowed until branches brushed against the truck's sides with soft scraping sounds. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, small, weathered, timber darkened by decades of snow and sun. Smoke did not rise from its chimney. No footprints marked the front porch. It looked abandoned. Daniel cut the engine. For a moment, neither he nor Atlas moved. The silence out here was different from the silence in his chest. But this silence had weight. He stepped out first, boots crunching against thin ice that had formed along the gravel. The air smelled like pine sap and cold stone. Atlas jumped down beside him. The dog paused, scanning the tree line with trained precision before following Daniel toward the cabin steps. The front door stuck slightly when Daniel pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest, like they had been waiting to complain. Inside, the air carried the scent of cedar and dust. Old wood. Faint ash from fires long burned out. The furniture hadn't changed. A plaid sofa, a wooden table scarred with knife marks from years of meal prep, a stone fireplace built by hands that understood winter. His father's hands. Daniel stepped inside fully and closed the door behind them. The silence wrapped around him immediately. No city noise, no distant sirens, no traffic, just the low hum of the wind pressing against cabin walls. Atlas walked the perimeter of the main room, nose low, tail steady. He moved room to room, clearing each space the way he had once cleared buildings overseas. When he returned to Daniel's side, he gave a short exhale and sat. Clear. Daniel dropped his duffel bag near the fireplace and stood there for a long time, looking at the hearth. His father had built it stone by stone when Daniel was a boy, back when winters meant splitting wood and stacking it just right so snow wouldn't ruin the pile. He remembered being 16, arguing in this very room about leaving town, about joining the army, about not wanting to live his whole life in a place where the biggest excitement was a snowstorm. His father hadn't yelled. He had simply said, "Show mountains don't move for storms." At the time, Daniel thought it was stubbornness. Now he wasn't sure. He knelt in front of the fireplace and ran his hand over the rough stone. Atlas lay down beside him, resting his head against Daniel's thigh. For a moment, Daniel closed his eyes. The memory came without warning. Rotor blades. Heat. The sharp crack of something exploding too close. He inhaled sharply. His hand tightened against the stone. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the cabin. Cold air. Stone. Wood. Atlas had lifted his head and was watching him. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I'm good," he murmured. The first night passed without unpacking. Daniel started a fire using wood stacked neatly near the wall. The flames caught slowly, licking up through kindling before settling into a steady burn. He sat in a wooden chair facing the hearth, boots still on, jacket draped across his shoulders. Atlas lay close, not asleep, but resting. Outside, snow began to fall, not heavy, just enough to soften the world. At some point near midnight, Daniel drifted off. He did not know how long he slept before it started. The sound, low at first, then louder, the rhythmic thrum of blades slicing through air. His eyes snapped open. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. The thrum grew louder in his head. He was no longer in the cabin. He was back under desert sky, sand whipping into his eyes, someone shouting coordinates he couldn't fully hear. Daniel's heart pounded. His breathing shortened. Atlas was on his feet instantly. The dog pressed against Daniel's chest. Heavy paws braced firmly against his thigh, forcing him backward into the chair. Daniel blinked. The helicopter sound wavered. Atlas nudged his jaw with his nose. Daniel focused on the dog's eyes. Amber. Steady. Present. He counted. 4 in. 4 hold. 4 out. The thrum faded. The cabin came back into focus. The only sound now was wind sliding across the roof and the quiet crackle of dying embers. Daniel's hands were shaking. Atlas lowered himself slowly, but did not move away. Daniel leaned forward and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. "I'm here," he whispered. It wasn't clear whether he meant Atlas or himself. The rest of the night passed in fragments. Short sleep, sudden waking. Atlas never fully relaxed. By morning, a thin layer of snow blanketed the porch. Daniel stepped outside, coffee steaming faintly in a tin mug. The mountains stretched wide and silent beneath pale winter light. He felt small out there, but not threatened, just exposed. He stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the tree line. He had come here to disappear. That was the truth he hadn't admitted yet. Not to Karen, not to the court, not even to himself. Disappear into a place where no one would evaluate him. No one would use words like unstable. But as Atlas stepped up beside him, shoulder brushing his leg, Daniel realized something else. Out here, there were no distractions, no noise, no excuses, just him. And the silence. And silence, he knew, could either break a man or force him to hear what he'd been avoiding. Behind them, inside the cabin, while the wooden floor creaked softly as the temperature shifted. Atlas's ears twitched. Daniel didn't notice. Not yet. The cabin settled the way old wood always does. Soft pops, low creaks, a shifting sigh as cold air pressed against warm beams. To anyone else, it would have been nothing more than a house adjusting to winter. But Atlas lifted his head. The dog's ears angled forward, body stiffening just slightly. His gaze drifted toward the narrow hallway that led to the back bedroom, the room Daniel had once slept in as a teenager, the room that still held a dented dresser and faded posters curling at the corners. Daniel stood on the porch a few seconds longer, finishing his coffee. The mountains in front of him were pale and endless, brushed in silver light. He told himself the stillness was good. Stillness meant no courtrooms. No evaluators. No eyes measuring him. Inside, Atlas rose quietly and padded toward the hallway. Daniel finally stepped back inside, closing the door against the cold. He brushed snow from his boots and hung his jacket on the same nail his father had used for decades. He saw Atlas standing at the end of the hallway, Clear, Daniel muttered, half to himself. Atlas did not move. Daniel frowned slightly. Hey. The dog glanced back at him, then lowered his head toward the floorboards. A single paw scratched once against the wood. Not frantic, not playful, intentional. Daniel walked down the hallway, boots thudding softly against the worn planks. The boards groaned under his weight. He stopped beside Atlas and looked down. The floor looked like any other section of the cabin. Old pine boards, dulled by years of use, but no obvious damage. Atlas scratched again, a sharper sound this time. "Knock it off," Daniel said automatically. The command was reflexive, the tone edged slightly harder than necessary. Lack of sleep had left him thin. Atlas froze, but he didn't back away. Instead, he pressed his nose against one specific board near the base of the closet and inhaled slowly. Then he looked up at Daniel, eyes steady. There was something in that look. Not anxiety, focus. Daniel crouched down reluctantly and ran his hand along the seam between two boards. His fingers paused. The wood dipped slightly under pressure. He pressed harder. The plank shifted, just a fraction. Daniel leaned back on his heels. His father had never been careless with repairs. Every nail in this cabin had been hammered straight, every board aligned tight. He reached for the butter knife lying on the small dresser, left over from the sandwich he'd eaten the night before, and slid the blade into the seam. It took effort. The wood resisted at first. Atlas stepped closer, watching. With a controlled pull, Daniel pried upward. The board lifted just enough for him to hook his fingers underneath. He hesitated. The air in the room felt heavier suddenly, like something had been waiting. He pulled. The plank came free with a low, splintering sound. Beneath it was a narrow cavity cut clean into the subfloor. Inside sat a metal box. Not large. Military issue. Olive drab, edges reinforced, surface scratched but intact. The kind of container used for ammunition or sensitive equipment. Daniel stared at it without blinking. Atlas exhaled slowly beside him. The box wasn't dusty. Once it hadn't been forgotten. It had been placed. Deliberately. Daniel reached down and lifted it carefully. It was heavier than it looked. His pulse ticked upward, not with panic, but with something sharper. Recognition. His father had served too. Vietnam. A different war, same silence when he returned home. Daniel carried the box into the main room and set it on the wooden table in front of the fireplace. The metal felt cold against his palms. Atlas circled once and sat close, tail still. Daniel studied the lid. A strip of red sealing wax ran across the latch. Impressed into it was a thumbprint. He swallowed. His father had always sealed important things that way. Documents, spare keys, once even a letter Daniel had received before deployment. This was no accident. Daniel broke the wax with the edge of the knife. Yet the sound was soft, but it echoed louder than it should have in the cabin. He flipped the latch. For a second, he didn't lift the lid. He wasn't afraid of what might be inside. He was afraid of what it might mean. Atlas nudged his elbow gently. Daniel inhaled once and opened the box. Inside, items were stacked with precise order. A leather-bound notebook worn at the corners. Several manila envelopes, dated in neat handwriting. A small USB flash drive secured with a rubber band. And beneath them, photocopies of documents clipped together. Daniel reached first for the notebook. The leather felt dry but preserved, like it had been stored with care. He opened to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Block letters. Clean. Military. If you're reading this, Danny, it means something went wrong. Daniel's throat tightened. He read on. I didn't build this place for hiding. I built it for weathering storms. He blinked slowly. Atlas shifted closer. The fire popped softly behind them, sending a flicker of orange light across the pages. Daniel turned to the next section. Dates, observations, short, factual entries. He recognized some of the time frames immediately. The months leading up to the divorce, notes about arguments overheard, conversations witnessed, mentions of financial discrepancies. His father had written like a soldier documenting a mission. No emotion in the phrasing. Just facts. He flipped open one of the manila envelopes. Inside were printed text messages. Karen's number at the top. Threats, subtle but clear. You'll never get primary custody with your record. Oh, you think the court will ignore your PTSD episodes? Daniel felt heat crawl up his spine. He remembered those messages. He had deleted them. He hadn't thought to save them. But someone had. His father. Atlas leaned his head lightly against Daniel's forearm. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He reached for another envelope. Bank statements. Highlighted transactions. Large transfers weeks before the initial custody filing. Daniel frowned. He hadn't known about those accounts. He looked back at the notebook. Soldiers don't panic. They prepare. The words were underlined once. Daniel stared at the line until it blurred. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a low, distant moan. Inside, something shifted. For the first time since the courtroom, the silence in his chest cracked. Not into anger, into awareness. And he wasn't the only one who had seen the storm coming. Atlas's ears twitched again. Daniel looked down at the dog. You knew something was there, he murmured. Atlas didn't wag. He didn't react with pride. He simply stayed. Steady. Daniel ran a hand slowly over the dog's neck. You don't sleep, do you? Atlas's eyes held his. No, he didn't. And now neither would Daniel. Because whatever his father had sealed beneath that floor wasn't meant to comfort him. It was meant to wake him up. The fire burned lower as night pressed against the windows. Daniel gathered the envelopes into careful stacks. The USB drive remained in the box. He hadn't opened it yet. He knew it would change something. He just didn't know how much. Atlas lay down beside the table, but his head remained lifted, watching, waiting. Outside, snow fell harder. Inside, for the first time since losing custody, Daniel didn't feel like a man disappearing. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something unfinished. And the storm he thought had already passed? It might just be beginning. The fire had burned down to a low bed of glowing coals by the time Daniel reached for the USB drive. He turned it over in his fingers. The plastic casing scratched, but intact. A strip of masking tape had been wrapped neatly around one end. In his father's careful block letters, it read, "For Danny." No extra words, no sentiment, just direct. Daniel rose from the table and crossed to the small desk tucked near the window. It still held the old laptop his father had used for basic emails and weather reports. Daniel hadn't even checked if it worked. He pressed the power button. Oh, for a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered faintly to life, the dull hum of aging electronics filling the quiet room. Atlas lifted his head but did not move. Daniel inserted the USB. A single folder appeared on the desktop. He hesitated only briefly before clicking it open. Inside were several files, scanned documents, photographs, audio clips labeled with dates, and one video file. Daniel's pulse quickened, not with panic, but anticipation. He opened the video first. The screen went black for a second, then flickered. His father appeared seated at the very same kitchen table Daniel had been using earlier. The camera angle was slightly crooked, as if it had taken a few tries to position correctly. His father looked older than Daniel remembered, lines deeper, shoulders narrower. But his eyes were steady, But he cleared his throat once before speaking. If you're watching this, Danny, then I'm not around to say it in person. The cabin seemed to grow quieter. Atlas rose and moved closer, settling near Daniel's chair. I never was much for speeches, his father continued. But I've been watching, and I've been preparing. Daniel swallowed. I know you think strength means carrying everything alone. You always did. Got that from me. His father gave a small, almost reluctant smile. That was my mistake. The wind brushed faintly against the cabin walls outside. I saw the way she talked to you, his father went on. Not yelling, not obvious, just planting doubt. I saw the way money moved. I saw the pattern. Daniel's jaw tightened. I didn't step in, his father admitted, because you're a grown man, and because sometimes storms have to show themselves before you build the right shelter. He leaned slightly closer to the camera. Atlas was trained to stay with you when I couldn't. Daniel froze. His father continued calmly. I pulled strings to make sure he landed in your unit. Best dog I'd seen in years. Smart, loyal. Doesn't quit when something matters. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Atlas, who was watching the screen as if he understood every word. You came back from war carrying more than you should have, his father said softly. That doesn't make you unstable. It makes you human. Daniel's throat tightened. I set money aside. I documented what I could, not because I thought you'd fail, but because I know paperwork scares people more than fists do. And you were walking into a fight where paper wins. The screen flickered slightly as his father adjusted in his chair. Don't panic. Don't explode. Don't disappear. Prepare. The video ended without dramatic music or final words. The screen returned to a silent desktop. Daniel sat motionless. Atlas placed his chin gently on Daniel's knee. Daniel exhaled slowly. For the first time since the courtroom, something shifted in his chest that wasn't numbness. It wasn't anger either. It was direction. He clicked through the other files. There were audio recordings of arguments, carefully clipped, clearly captured. His father's calm voice occasionally heard in the background, intervening quietly when conversations escalated. There were bank statements highlighting transfers Daniel had never known about. Funds moved from joint accounts weeks before Karen had filed for custody adjustments. There were screenshots of messages threatening to use his PTSD diagnosis against him. Each piece was labeled with a date, organized, strategic. Daniel leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes briefly. He remembered the night Karen had told him maybe he wasn't stable enough for primary custody. The way she had said it gently, almost concerned. At the time, he had doubted himself. Now, staring at documented patterns, he saw something else. Control. Atlas nudged him softly. Daniel opened his eyes. Old man wasn't just splitting firewood, he muttered. Atlas's ears flicked. Daniel stood and walked back to the table, gathering the documents into careful stacks. But he felt steadier than he had that morning on the courthouse steps. Not because the pain was gone, because it had shape now. He wasn't fighting ghosts. He was fighting facts. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing snow against the windows in fine streaks. Daniel moved to the fireplace and added 2 more logs. Flames rose higher, casting warmer light across the cabin walls. He looked down at Atlas. You've been watching me this whole time, haven't you? Atlas held his gaze, tail resting still against the floor. Daniel knelt beside him and ran a hand slowly along the dog's shoulder. You didn't scratch that floor for nothing. Atlas leaned subtly into his touch. Daniel felt something else then, something unfamiliar. Hope. Not loud, not reckless. Just a quiet flicker, like the beginning of a fire catching dry wood. And he gathered the USB and documents again and placed them neatly back inside the metal box. Then he looked at the space beneath the removed floorboard. The hiding place. He could have left it there, closed it back up, pretended none of it existed, gone back to surviving day by day. But his father hadn't hidden those things to be forgotten. He had sealed them to be found when the time was right. Daniel stood slowly. "I'm not disappearing," he said quietly into the room. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. Atlas rose beside him. Outside, the mountains stood unmoving beneath gathering clouds. Inside, Daniel no longer felt hollow. He felt awake. The storm outside the windows began to gather strength, wind deepening its tone across the timber walls. Daniel glanced toward the tree line. He had thought the fight was over, but that losing custody was the end of it. But now, with the evidence laid bare and his father's voice echoing in his mind, he understood something simple and unshakable. He hadn't lost. He had just been unprepared. And for the first time since the gavel struck wood in Cheyenne, Daniel Mercer wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he needed to build. He stepped outside just before dusk to stack more firewood against the side of the cabin. The sky over the Wind River Range had shifted from pale winter blue to a darker shade, heavy and bruised along the horizon. The air had changed, colder, sharper. Atlas followed him without command, scanning the tree line with focused intensity. His posture was different now, not relaxed observation, but readiness. Daniel paused, noticing it. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Atlas's ears angled forward. His body stiffened. Then the wind hit. It came down the slope like a sudden wall, sweeping loose snow across the clearing. Pine branches groaned overhead, bending under the first strong gust. Daniel looked toward the west. The storm had arrived faster than forecast. He moved quickly, stacking the remaining logs against the porch wall and securing the tarp with tight knots. Atlas stayed close, weaving between Daniel and the tree line, alert to every shift in sound. Another gust slammed against the cabin, rattling the loose shutters. The wind carried a hollow, rising howl. Daniel froze. For a fraction of a second, it wasn't wind. It was rotor blades again. The sound crawled into his head, layered with memory. Sand. Heat. Someone shouting coordinates. Yes, the sharp metallic rhythm of something closing in too fast. His breathing shortened. Atlas turned instantly. The dog pressed his full weight against Daniel's thigh, pushing him backward slightly, breaking the stance. Daniel blinked. The mountains returned. Snow whipped across his boots. He inhaled sharply. 4 in, hold, 4 out. Atlas stayed firm against him until Daniel's shoulders loosened. "Good," Daniel muttered under his breath. "Good boy." The wind intensified. A loud crack split the air. Daniel looked up just in time to see a thick pine branch snap free from a nearby tree. It tumbled downward toward the edge of the cabin roof. "Inside," he commanded. They moved together. The branch struck the porch roof with a heavy thud, sliding partially across the eaves before lodging against the gutter. The cabin shuddered. Daniel shut the door hard behind them and secured the deadbolt. The lights flickered once, then twice, then went out. Darkness filled the room except for the glow of the fireplace. The wind roared against the cabin walls now, not as a whisper, but as a force. Daniel grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and clicked it on. Atlas moved toward the hallway instinctively, checking the structure. The cabin creaked under pressure. Daniel stepped to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. The branch hanging over the roof shifted again. Another strong gust could send it crashing fully through the porch supports. He made a decision quickly. "Stay," he told Atlas. He grabbed his coat, gloves, and the old chainsaw hanging in the small shed just off the back. Atlas followed anyway. The wind hit Daniel full in the chest when he opened the door. Snow stung his face, cutting sideways in sheets. The branch above them groaned as it scraped against the cabin's edge. Daniel pulled the starter cord on the chainsaw. Once. Twice. On the third pull, the engine roared to life. The sound was loud, mechanical, grounding. He stepped carefully onto the snow-covered porch, boots sliding slightly on ice. The branch was wedged against the roofline, heavy and unstable. Atlas stayed close to Daniel's leg despite the noise, eyes locked upward. Another gust tore through the clearing. The branch shifted. Daniel positioned himself near the thickest point of the limb and began cutting carefully at the base where it met the trunk. The saw bit into the wood, spraying chips into the wind. For a moment, yes, the world narrowed to vibration and force. Then it happened. A sharper crack above. The branch snapped prematurely. It dropped faster than Daniel expected. Atlas lunged forward. The dog slammed his body into Daniel's knee, knocking him sideways just as the branch crashed down. The heavy wood struck the porch railing where Daniel had been standing seconds earlier. The impact splintered wood. Daniel fell hard onto his side in the snow. The chainsaw sputtered and died. For a heartbeat, there was only wind. Then he heard it. A low whine. Atlas! Daniel scrambled upright. Atlas had been clipped by the falling branch. The dog staggered slightly, one front leg held awkwardly close to his body. Daniel's pulse spiked. He dropped to his knees in the snow, cradling Atlas's head carefully. Easy. Easy. Atlas did not cry out again. He leaned into Daniel's chest, breathing fast but controlled. Daniel ran his hands gently along the dog's leg. No bone protruding, no obvious break, but the shoulder joint looked wrong. The storm howled around them. Inside, Daniel whispered. He lifted Atlas carefully, ignoring the pain in his own shoulder from the fall, and carried him into the cabin. Snow swirled through the open doorway before Daniel kicked it shut. He laid Atlas near the fireplace on a thick, folded blanket. The dog's eyes remained fixed on him, steady despite the pain. Daniel's hands moved with trained precision. He examined the leg again under flashlight. Likely dislocation, maybe a strain. He had field experience with injuries. Different terrain, same urgency. Stay with me, he murmured. Atlas's breathing slowed gradually under Daniel's voice. Outside, the storm continued to batter the cabin. Inside, Daniel worked. He wrapped the leg carefully, stabilizing it as best he could. Atlas flinched once but did not pull away. Good, Daniel said quietly. Good boy. Minutes stretched long. The storm did not ease, but inside that small cabin, something shifted again. Daniel sat back on the floor beside Atlas, snow melting off his coat and soaking into the wood. The branch damage outside would need repair. The porch railing was splintered. The roof might have taken strain, but they were intact. Atlas had moved first, protected him. Again. Daniel placed his forehead gently against the dog's. You don't quit, do you? Atlas's tail thumped weakly once against the floor. Daniel exhaled. The storm outside no longer sounded like rotor blades. It sounded like wind. Real. Present. Manageable. He rose slowly and added more wood to the fire. Flames climbed higher, filling the cabin with steady warmth. Daniel returned to the blanket and sat beside Atlas. The dog rested his head on Daniel's thigh. For the first time since arriving in the mountains, Daniel did not feel like he was hiding from something. He felt like he had just been tested, and he hadn't broken. The wind continued its assault outside, but the cabin stood, and so did he. The storm burned itself out sometime before dawn. By morning, the Wind River Mountains looked untouched again, blanketed in fresh snow that erased the violence of the night. The broken porch railing sat half-buried beneath white drifts, as if the mountain had decided to cover its own scars. Inside the cabin, the air was warm. Atlas lay on a thick blanket near the fireplace, his injured shoulder wrapped firmly. He had slept in short stretches, waking whenever Daniel shifted. Each time Daniel leaned down to check him, Atlas's tail gave a faint thump against the wood floor. "You saved me," Daniel said quietly at one point, brushing a hand through the dog's fur. Atlas didn't respond with excitement. He simply stayed. Daniel brewed coffee in the old percolator his father had used for decades. The smell filled the cabin, strong, bitter, grounding. He moved slower than usual, feeling the soreness in his own side from where he had fallen in the snow. He stepped outside briefly to inspect the damage. The branch had splintered the porch railing, but hadn't pierced the roof. The tarp still held. The cabin had taken the hit and endured. He knelt to examine the tracks in the snow. Atlas's paw prints overlapped his own from the night before. Close, protective, never more than a foot away. Daniel stood scanning the horizon. Then he heard it. Not wind, not memory. An engine. Low at first, then closer. His body stiffened automatically. Atlas, still inside, gave a short bark. Daniel turned toward the narrow road that wound up the mountain. Through the trees, he caught sight of headlights cutting through the snow glare. A sheriff's SUV. His jaw tightened. The vehicle approached slowly, tires crunching over frozen gravel. It came to a stop near the edge of the clearing. Daniel did not retreat inside. He did not hide. He walked forward instead, boots steady in the snow. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his hat against the cold. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of decades in mountain weather. "Morning," Briggs called out. Daniel gave a short nod. "Sheriff?" Briggs's gaze shifted briefly past Daniel to the cabin, then to the broken railing, then back again. "We got a welfare call last night," Briggs said. "Concern about your condition." Daniel knew exactly where it came from. Karen. The timing wasn't coincidence. "She claimed you'd relocated here in unstable circumstances," Briggs continued, tone neutral. "Said you were isolating." Daniel let out a slow breath through his nose. "I'm on my own property," he said evenly. Briggs studied him carefully. "Oh, you alone out here?" Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. "My service dog's inside." As if on cue, Atlas stepped into the doorway behind Daniel. Even injured, the German shepherd stood tall. One leg was carefully placed, but his posture was alert and protective. Briggs noticed the bandage immediately. "What happened there?" "Branch came down in the storm," Daniel replied. "He pushed me clear." Briggs walked a few steps closer, boots sinking into snow. He crouched slightly to examine Atlas from a respectful distance. Atlas did not growl. He did not retreat. He held steady eye contact. "That's so," Briggs murmured. Daniel nodded. Silence stretched between them. The mountain wind moved gently through the trees now, far calmer than the night before. Briggs straightened slowly. "Mind if I take a look inside?" he asked. Daniel stepped aside without argument. The sheriff entered the cabin, glancing around at the neat stacks of firewood, the organized table where documents still lay sorted, the metal box resting closed near the edge. The air was warm, clean, orderly, not chaotic. Briggs paused near the fireplace. "You got power?" "Generator kicks in if needed." "Food?" Daniel opened a cabinet to show canned goods, dried supplies, carefully arranged. Briggs nodded. Then his eyes landed on the open notebook near the table. He didn't touch it, just observed. "You served?" Briggs asked after a moment. "Yes, sir." Briggs studied Daniel's posture, the way he stood slightly angled toward Atlas, the way his movements were deliberate rather than erratic. "You getting help?" Briggs asked carefully. Daniel didn't bristle. "I see a therapist in Cheyenne," he said. "Regular appointments." Briggs nodded once. Outside, wind lifted snow lightly against the windows. Briggs stepped toward the door again and turned back before leaving. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, voice lower now, "I've seen unstable." He glanced at Atlas, then back at Daniel. "This isn't it." The words settled heavier than the gavel had days earlier. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He simply held Briggs's gaze. Briggs tipped his hat slightly. "If you need anything, you call. Don't let pride freeze you out here." With that, he stepped back into the snow. The SUV's engine started again, tires crunching as it turned carefully down the mountain road. Daniel stood there watching until the vehicle disappeared beyond the bend, and Atlas limped forward and leaned gently against his leg. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The wind brushed across the clearing, quiet and controlled. He knelt slowly beside Atlas and rested his forehead against the dog's. "They don't get to define us," he murmured. Atlas's tail tapped once against the snow. Daniel rose and turned back toward the cabin. The broken railing still needed repair. The documents still needed review. There was work ahead. But for the first time since the courtroom, someone outside his own mind had said the words he hadn't been able to form. "This isn't a broken man." Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steady and strong, and Daniel Mercer no longer felt like a man running from a verdict. He felt like a man preparing for the next one. 2 days later, when the mountain road had hardened into a strip of packed ice, the storm's fresh snow had settled, turning the forest into something almost peaceful again. Daniel had reinforced the porch railing with spare boards from the shed. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. Atlas's shoulder had improved slightly. He still favored the leg, but the swelling had gone down. Daniel adjusted the bandage carefully before they left that morning. "We're taking a drive," he told the dog. Atlas rose without hesitation. The town of Riverton sat quiet under winter sun when they arrived. Brick storefronts lined the main street. A faded barber pole turned lazily outside a shop that likely hadn't changed in 40 years. A hardware store sign creaked faintly in the cold breeze. Daniel parked in front of First Mountain Community Bank. The building was small. It's red brick, clean windows, a brass plaque near the door listing the names of local board members. His father's name had once been on that plaque. Daniel stepped inside. The bank smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. A soft bell chimed as the door closed behind him. Atlas walked at his side, vest visible, gait careful but steady. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She glanced up and paused for a moment when she saw him. "Daniel Mercer," she said softly. He recognized her then. Margaret Hale. She had handled his father's accounts for years. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped out from behind the counter and extended her hand. "I was sorry to hear about your father," she said quietly. "He spoke about you often." Daniel nodded once. "I'm here about the safety deposit box," he said. Margaret's expression shifted, subtle but meaningful. "I thought you might be," she replied. She led him down a narrow hallway to the vault room. The heavy door swung open with a metallic hum that echoed in the small space. Rows of locked boxes lined the walls. Margaret stopped in front of one near the bottom. "Registered in your name," she said. "Your father set it up 5 years ago." Daniel swallowed. She stepped aside, giving him privacy. He knelt, inserted the key his father had hidden in the notebook, and turned it slowly. The box slid out with a low scrape. He carried it to a small table in the corner. Inside were 3 items: a thick envelope sealed with a bank stamp, a cashier's check, and a flash drive separate from the one at the cabin. Oh, Daniel lifted the check first. The amount wasn't enormous, but it was enough. Enough to cover legal fees, enough to give him breathing room, enough to prevent desperation from shaping decisions. He stared at the signature line. His father had worked extra shifts at the hardware store long after retirement. Daniel had thought it was pride. It had been preparation. He opened the envelope next. Copies of joint account statements from the final year of his marriage. Transfers circled in red ink. Large withdrawals weeks before Karen had filed custody modification. Notes written in the margins in his father's handwriting. Transferred to personal account. Timing suspicious. Document pattern. Daniel's jaw tightened. There were also notarized statements. One from a neighbor who had overheard heated arguments, and one from a former coworker of Karen's who described concerns about financial manipulation. Margaret's voice broke the silence gently. "He asked me to make sure you received everything only if you came yourself," she said. Daniel looked up. "He said storms don't scare him," she added. "But the ones that come with paperwork do." Daniel let out a breath that felt half laugh, half ache. That sounds like him. Margaret studied Atlas briefly. "That dog's been trained," she observed. "Yes, ma'am. Your father came in once with a trainer. Spoke about ensuring you had the right partner when you returned from overseas." Daniel's chest tightened again. Margaret stepped back toward the vault door. "If you need referrals for a good attorney, I know a few in the area." "I already have one," Daniel replied. Blake Holloway." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Smart man. Steady." Daniel placed the documents carefully back inside the envelope and slid the items into his bag. Outside, the town felt smaller than it had years ago. But Daniel didn't feel small inside it. He sat in his truck for a moment before starting the engine. Atlas rested his head gently on Daniel's arm. Daniel looked at him. "You've been part of this longer than I knew," he said quietly. Atlas blinked slowly. Daniel drove toward Blake Holloway's office. The law firm occupied the second floor above a bakery. The scent of fresh bread drifted faintly through the stairwell. Blake Holloway was in his early 40s, lean, composed, with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for calm courtroom strategy. And he listened without interruption as Daniel laid the documents across the desk. Bank statements, audio transcripts, notarized statements, PTSD evaluation records. Blake leaned back slowly in his chair. "This changes everything," he said. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded. "What's next?" he asked. Blake tapped a finger lightly against the stack of papers. "We amend the filing. We request a financial review. We submit these records formally. And we prepare for pushback." Daniel absorbed that. "Will it be enough?" he asked. Blake studied him carefully. "Truth, documented properly, usually is," he said. Daniel looked down at Atlas lying near the desk. The dog's injured shoulder was still wrapped, but his posture was steady. "We'll do it right," Daniel said quietly. Blake nodded. Outside, the mountains waited beneath winter sky. The fight ahead would not be loud. It would not be explosive. It would be deliberate. Paper by paper, fact by fact. Daniel left the office with a folder thicker than the one he had carried in. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, wind moved softly through Riverton's quiet streets. Atlas walked at his side. Daniel did not feel like a man begging for custody anymore. He felt like a soldier studying terrain. The storm hadn't ended. It had shifted. And this time, he wasn't caught unprepared. The evaluation was scheduled for the following Tuesday in Cheyenne. Daniel hadn't been back to that city since the verdict. The drive down from the mountains felt different now. Not because the landscape had changed, but because he had. Atlas lay in the passenger seat, shoulders still wrapped, Ma breathing steady. The dog had refused to stay behind. Daniel hadn't argued. The VA clinic sat in a low brick building near the edge of town. Nothing dramatic, no grand architecture, just clean windows, neutral walls, and a waiting room filled with men and women who carried stories quietly. Daniel signed in without hesitation. He recognized the looks, some nods from other veterans, some guarded expressions. No one asked questions. Atlas remained at his side, calm, alert. Dr. Elaine Foster stepped into the waiting room 20 minutes later. Mid-50s, professional, direct eyes. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Daniel rose. Atlas stood with him. In the evaluation room, the walls were plain, no diplomas on display, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a soft lamp near the corner. Dr. Foster glanced briefly at Atlas. "Service animal?" "Yes." "Oh, ma'am." She nodded and gestured toward the chair. "Let's begin." Daniel had sat in rooms like this before. Some sessions had been productive. Others had felt like interrogations. This one felt different from the start. Dr. Foster did not open with sympathy. She opened with clarity. "You understand this evaluation may be submitted to the court?" "Yes." "And you're prepared to speak honestly?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a moment. "Tell me about the night storms." Daniel didn't hesitate. He described the rotor sounds that weren't there, the way wind sometimes turned into memory, the flashbacks that came uninvited, the breathing techniques he used to ground himself. Atlas shifted slightly at his feet. Dr. Foster observed the movement. "How often do the flashbacks occur?" "Less than they used to," Daniel replied. "More when I'm under stress." "Did you experience one during the custody hearing?" Daniel paused. "Yes." "What did you do?" "I stayed." Dr. Foster tilted her head slightly. "You stayed?" "I didn't leave the room. I didn't react. I controlled it." She made a note. "What about anger?" Daniel considered carefully. "I don't explode," he said. "I shut down." "And is that safer?" "For everyone? Usually." Dr. Foster studied him closely. "And for you?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Atlas lifted his head and rested it gently against Daniel's boot. Daniel glanced down. "For me," he said slowly, "it can feel like I disappear." The room went quiet for a moment. Dr. Foster leaned back in her chair. "Do you pose a danger to your child?" "No." "Have you ever harmed her?" "Never." "Have you ever threatened to?" "No." "Do you use alcohol or substances to cope?" "No." Dr. Foster tapped her pen lightly against her notebook. "What do you use?" Daniel looked down at Atlas. "Structure," he said. "Routine. And him." Dr. Foster's gaze shifted toward the dog. "Tell me about him." Daniel's voice softened slightly. "He grounds me before I spiral. He interrupts episodes. He keeps proximity when I isolate. He was trained for it." Dr. Foster nodded slowly. "And last week, during the storm?" Daniel exhaled quietly. "He pushed me clear of a falling branch." "While injured?" "Yes." Silence settled again, not heavy, observant. Dr. Foster closed her notebook. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "PTSD is not instability. It's injury. Managed injury." Daniel held her gaze. "You've demonstrated awareness, coping mechanisms, and restraint," she continued. "You sought therapy voluntarily. You maintain structure. You have a consistent support system." Her eyes flicked briefly to Atlas again. "I will note that." Daniel didn't react outwardly. but something inside him eased. He hadn't come to beg. He had come to stand. When the session ended, Dr. Foster extended her hand. "You're not your diagnosis," she said quietly. Daniel shook her hand. "Thank you." Outside, the Wyoming wind moved lightly across the parking lot. Daniel walked to the truck with Atlas at his side. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady. As he opened the driver's door, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Karen. He stared at the screen for a moment, then answered. "Oh, yes. I heard you're filing to amend," she said, voice calm but edged. "Yes." There was a pause. "You really think that cabin proves stability?" Daniel glanced at Atlas settling into the seat. "It's not the cabin," he replied. "What is it then?" "Preparation." Silence on the other end. "You always retreat when things get hard," she said finally. Daniel looked out at the wide stretch of sky above Cheyenne. "No," he said quietly. "I build." He ended the call before she could respond. The drive back into the mountains felt different from every drive before it. Not because the road was smoother, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because Daniel Mercer was no longer fighting to prove he wasn't broken. He was proving he was disciplined. And discipline, unlike fear, does not vanish in silence. When as the cabin came back into view near sunset, smoke already rising faintly from the chimney he'd relit before leaving, Daniel felt something settle firmly inside him. Not anger, not desperation. Resolve. Atlas shifted closer in the passenger seat. Daniel reached over and rested his hand briefly on the dog's neck. "Next round," he murmured. The mountains stood tall around them. And this time he stood just as steady. The courthouse in Cheyenne looked the same as it had weeks earlier. Same stone steps, same flag snapping in the Wyoming wind, same echo of boots against polished floors. But Daniel Mercer did not feel the same walking through those doors. Atlas moved beside him, shoulder fully healed now, bandage gone. The dog's stride was smooth again, confident. Heads turned as they entered the hallway outside the courtroom, some curious, some skeptical. Daniel didn't lower his eyes. Blake Holloway stood near the bench outside courtroom B, reviewing a folder thick with documents. "You ready?" Blake asked quietly. Daniel nodded once. Inside the courtroom, Karen Whitmore sat with her attorney. She looked composed, dressed sharply, posture relaxed as if she were attending a business meeting rather than a custody amendment. Her new husband, Richard Whitmore, sat behind her. Expensive watch, confident posture, the kind of man who believed comfort equaled stability. Emily sat between them. She looked smaller than Daniel remembered. When her eyes met his, something flickered there. Uncertainty, maybe hope. Daniel held her gaze and offered the faintest nod. He took his seat calmly. The judge entered. Proceedings began without drama. But Karen's attorney spoke first. Polished words, calm accusations. He described Daniel as emotionally unpredictable, emphasized past PTSD episodes, suggested that isolation in the mountains showed instability rather than recovery. Daniel did not react. He listened. Atlas lay quietly at his feet, chin resting on crossed paws. Blake stood when it was his turn. His voice was not loud. It was measured. He presented the financial records first, transfers dated just before the initial custody filing, statements showing large sums moved into Karen's personal account without disclosure. The judge's expression shifted slightly. Blake introduced notarized witness statements, pattern evidence, timeline alignment. Then came Dr. Foster's evaluation. Blake read carefully. Condition managed. No signs of violent impulse. Demonstrates structured coping strategies. Support system present. Karen's attorney objected briefly. Overruled. Blake continued. He did not attack Karen's character. He focused on documentation. Fact after fact. Line after line. The room grew quieter with each page turned. Daniel kept his breathing even. 4 in, 4 out. When it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly. He did not look at Karen. He did not look at Richard. He looked at the judge. "I never stopped being her father," he said. No long speech. No emotional outburst. Just truth delivered without force. The judge studied him for a long moment, then turned to review notes. The silence in the room felt different from the first hearing. Not heavy, not condemning, waiting. The judge spoke clearly. Primary custody is amended. A joint custody reinstated with extended visitation, granted to Mr. Mercer. The words landed like a shift in gravity. Karen's posture tightened. Richard leaned back stiffly. Emily's breath caught audibly. Daniel did not celebrate. He did not smile widely. He exhaled. Atlas lifted his head slightly. The gavel struck wood. This time it did not feel like a sentence. It felt like balance. Outside the courthouse, the sky stretched wide and bright. Emily approached him slowly. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi, kiddo." There was a pause. "Are you going back to the cabin?" she asked. "Yes." She hesitated. "Can I see it?" Daniel glanced at Karen briefly. Karen looked away. "Yes," Daniel answered. Emily stepped closer. Atlas wagged his tail gently. She reached down cautiously and touched his head. "I heard you got hurt," she said. Atlas leaned into her hand. "He saved me," Daniel replied. Emily looked up at him differently now. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with something rebuilding. They walked toward the truck together. The mountains waited beyond the city. Daniel opened the passenger door for Emily. She climbed in, Atlas settling carefully between them in the back seat. As Daniel started the engine, he glanced once at the courthouse in the rearview mirror. He didn't feel victorious. He felt accountable. This wasn't the end. It was responsibility returned. As they drove north toward the Wind River Range, the road rising gradually into higher elevation, Emily watched the mountains through the window. "Are you going to disappear again?" she asked quietly after a while. Daniel tightened his hand slightly on the steering wheel. "No," he said. "We stay. Together." Atlas shifted and rested his chin on the seat between them. The mountains grew closer. And for the first time since the gavel had struck weeks earlier, Daniel Mercer wasn't walking away from something. He was driving toward home. The road narrowed as they climbed back into the Wind River Mountains. Pine trees thickened on both sides, their branches heavy with late-season snow. The sky stretched pale and open above them, washed clean after days of shifting storms. Emily leaned forward between the seats as the cabin came into view. "That's it?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "That's it." The cabin stood firm against the mountain slope. The repaired porch railing looked rough but sturdy. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, curling into the cold air. Atlas let out a low sound in his throat, almost like recognition. When Daniel parked, Emily stepped out slowly, boots crunching in snow. She turned in a circle, taking in the clearing, the trees, the silence. "It's quiet," she said. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "It is." He watched her carefully, not hovering, not distant, present. Atlas moved beside her, brushing gently against her leg as if offering silent reassurance. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than the winter outside. Firelight flickered across the walls. The air carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Emily walked through each room cautiously, running her fingers along the table, the shelves, the old photographs Daniel had placed back on the mantel. "Did Grandpa live here?" she asked. Daniel nodded. For a while." She paused near the bedroom doorway. "Is this where the storm hit?" Daniel followed her gaze toward the repaired boards on the porch outside the window. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Atlas made sure I was still standing." Emily knelt beside the dog and wrapped her arms carefully around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur. Atlas leaned gently into her, eyes half closed. Daniel turned toward the section of flooring near the old bedroom, the place Atlas had scratched days earlier. He had replaced the boards temporarily after retrieving the metal box, but he hadn't secured them permanently. Something about it had felt unfinished. "Emily," he said softly, "come here a second." She stood and joined him. He knelt and ran his hand along the floorboards. "Atlas found something here." Her eyes widened slightly. Like treasure?" Daniel let out a quiet breath. "Something like that." He removed the screws he'd loosely secured days before and lifted the boards again. Beneath them sat the hollow space he had uncovered earlier. Emily knelt beside him. "That's where the box was?" she asked. "Yes." Daniel reached deeper into the cavity, feeling along the edge where he hadn't fully searched before. His fingers brushed against something else. Paper. He pulled it out carefully. A smaller envelope, aged and sealed, wedged tightly between two support beams. His father's handwriting stretched across the front. "For Emily." Daniel's breath caught for a moment. Emily looked up at him. "What is it?" He handed it to her gently. "It's yours." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were property documents, transfer papers, the cabin deed, signed and notarized, transferring ownership upon Daniel's remarriage or custody reinstatement directly to Emily Mercer, and a handwritten letter folded behind it. Daniel unfolded the letter slowly and read aloud. "Home isn't a place you hide. It's where you rebuild. If you're reading this, then the storm didn't win, and neither did fear." Emily's eyes filled with quiet tears. "Grandpa did this?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. "He prepared," he said. She looked around the cabin differently now. Not as a hiding place, not as exile, as inheritance. Atlas shifted and lay down beside them, his body forming a quiet barrier between the outside world and the space they knelt in. Emily wiped her eyes. "Does that mean we stay?" Daniel looked at her carefully. "If you want to." She glanced toward the window, where mountains stretched wide and silent, then back at him. "I think I like it here," she said. Daniel felt something inside him settle deeper than victory ever could. Not relief, not pride. Ground. He replaced the envelope carefully and secured the floorboards properly this time, tightening each screw with steady hands. When he stood, Emily stepped forward and hugged him tightly. He hesitated only a second before wrapping his arms around her. Atlas rose and pressed gently against both of them, completing the circle. Outside, wind moved softly through pine branches. Inside, the fire burned steady. Daniel understood something then. The cabin had never been an escape. The money hadn't been rescue. The evidence hadn't been revenge. It had been preparation. His father had prepared. Atlas had protected, and Daniel had finally chosen to build instead of retreat. Emily pulled back slightly. "Dad?" "Yeah." "You didn't disappear." Daniel rested his hand gently on her head. "No," he said. "I didn't." The mountains stood outside, unmoving and ancient. But inside that small cabin, something new had taken root. Not fear, not silence. Home. The word felt unfamiliar in Daniel's chest. That night, the three of them sat near the fireplace. Emily had insisted on making hot chocolate using the old metal pot Daniel's father once used for coffee. It was too sweet and slightly scorched at the bottom, but neither of them complained. Atlas lay stretched across the rug, one ear flicking every time a log shifted in the fire. Emily studied the room carefully. "Did you sleep here alone?" she asked. Daniel nodded. Was it scary?" He considered the question. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "Because of bears?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Not bears." She watched him more closely now. 9 years old, but perceptive. "Was it the memories?" she asked softly. Daniel didn't expect that. He met her eyes. "Yes." She nodded as if that made sense. Emily stood and walked toward the window. Outside, moonlight washed the snow in silver. The mountains looked endless. "Mom says mountains are lonely," she said. Daniel joined her at the window. "They can be," he replied, "if you're running." She looked up at him. "Were you running?" He paused. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "But I might have been hiding too." Emily didn't answer right away. She leaned her forehead lightly against the glass. "I don't want you to hide," she said. Daniel felt the weight of that more than any courtroom verdict. "I won't," he replied. Atlas rose slowly and came to stand between them, pressing gently against Daniel's leg. Emily knelt and wrapped her arms around the dog again. "He always knows when you're sad," she said. Daniel watched the firelight reflect in Atlas's eyes. "He was trained to," Daniel answered. "But he chooses to." Emily smiled faintly. "Is that why he sleeps next to your bed?" "Yes." "Will he sleep next to mine too?" Daniel chuckled softly. "If you let him." That night, Emily insisted on setting up a small cot in the living room near the fire instead of taking the bedroom. She said she liked hearing the wind outside, said it made the cabin feel alive. Daniel lay awake longer than he had in weeks, not because of flashbacks, but because of responsibility. He listened to Emily's steady breathing, listened to Atlas shift once, then settle again. The wind brushed gently against the cabin walls, not violent, not haunting, just present. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The cold air filled his lungs sharply. Stars stretched across the Wyoming sky in impossible numbers. Daniel stood on the porch and looked out over the clearing. Weeks ago, this place had felt like exile. Now it felt like foundation. He thought about his father, about preparation, about storms, about how strength wasn't volume. It was endurance. The door creaked softly behind him. Emily stepped out in her socks, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Daniel crouched down beside her. "Why?" She hesitated. "Are you still sad?" she asked, and he considered that carefully. "I'm not as sad as I was," he said. "But I still miss things." She nodded. "I miss when we all lived in one house," she said. Daniel swallowed. "Me too." She stepped closer and leaned into him. "But I like this house better," she added after a moment. "Why?" "Because you look different here." Daniel felt something tighten in his throat. "How different?" "You don't look like you're somewhere else," she said simply. He didn't realize he'd been holding that expression for years. Atlas pushed the door open with his nose and stepped outside as well, standing watch automatically at the edge of the porch. Emily noticed. "He's guarding us," she whispered. Daniel smiled faintly. "He always does." They stood there together under the vast mountain sky, and the three of them forming a small silhouette against something much larger. After a while, Emily yawned. "Come on," Daniel said softly. "Let's get you warm." Inside, he tucked her in carefully. She grabbed his sleeve before he could stand. "Dad?" "Yes?" "If the storm comes again, you won't disappear, right?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "Storm or no storm, I stay." She studied his face one last time, satisfied. Atlas lay down beside her cot. Daniel returned to the fireplace and sat quietly for a few minutes longer. The fire burned low now, embers glowing deep red beneath ash. He wasn't a man erased by trauma. He wasn't a man rescued by money. He wasn't a man redeemed by a courtroom. He was a father who had almost lost his ground, and then chose to rebuild it. The mountains didn't promise safety, but they promised weather, and Daniel Mercer was finally ready to stand through all of it. He added one last log to the fire. Then he turned down the lamp. In the darkness, there was no echo of helicopters, no courtroom gavel, only steady breathing, and the quiet, unshakable presence of home. Morning arrived gently over the Wind River Range. Pale light slipped through the frost-laced windows, brushing the wooden floor in soft gold. The fire had burned down to ash, but the cabin still held warmth. Daniel woke before the others. For a moment, he didn't move. He listened. No helicopters in the distance, no courtroom echoes, no wind screaming against the walls, just the rhythm of Emily's breathing from the cot, and Atlas's deeper, protective rumble near her feet. Daniel sat up slowly and swung his boots onto the floor. Yet he walked to the window and looked out at the clearing. Snow glistened untouched. The mountains stood steady, not threatening, not testing, just there. Behind him, Emily stirred. "Dad?" she murmured sleepily. "I'm here." She pushed herself upright, hair messy, blanket slipping off one shoulder. "Did we miss the sunrise?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Not yet." They stepped outside together, Atlas padding beside them. The air was sharp but calm, the kind of cold that wakes you fully instead of biting. Daniel wrapped a coat around Emily's shoulders, and the three of them stood at the edge of the porch. The sun began to crest over the ridge. Light spilled slowly across the valley, touching pine trees first, then drifting down toward the cabin roof. Emily reached for Daniel's hand. "Grandpa used to watch this?" she asked. "Every morning," Daniel replied. She squeezed his fingers tighter. "I think he knew," she said quietly. "Knew what?" "That we'd come back." Daniel looked at the cabin behind them, at the repaired railing, at the chimney carrying smoke, at the floor beneath which secrets had waited patiently. His father hadn't built a fortress. He'd built a future. Atlas shifted and stepped forward suddenly, ears pricked toward the tree line. Daniel's body responded instinctively, but not with panic. He watched. A deer stepped cautiously into the clearing, pausing long enough to study the quiet human shapes on the porch. Emily held her breath. Atlas did not bark. He simply stood. The deer moved on after a few seconds, vanishing into the trees. Emily exhaled slowly. "See?" she whispered. Even the animals aren't scared." Daniel knelt to her level. "They're careful," he corrected gently, "but not scared." She considered that. "I want to be like that," she said. Daniel rested his hand on Atlas's back. "Me too." They went back inside for breakfast. Simple eggs, toast, coffee for Daniel, cocoa for Emily. Atlas lay near the door, eyes half closed but aware. Later that afternoon, Daniel carried a toolbox out to the porch. Emily followed with a small bucket of nails. They worked together, reinforcing the railing properly this time. Not as a temporary fix, but as something meant to last. "You think storms will come again?" Emily asked while handing him screws. "Yes," Daniel answered honestly. "Big ones?" "Probably." She nodded once. "Okay." No fear in her voice, just acceptance. Daniel tightened the final bolt and leaned back to examine their work. Solid, not perfect, but strong. Emily stepped beside him. "It's ours now," she said. Daniel looked down at her. "Yes," he replied. "It is." Inside the cabin, he walked to the section of floor they had resealed. He rested his hand there briefly. The secrets beneath had done their work. The evidence had changed the court. The money had opened doors. But none of that had rebuilt him. He had done that himself. With discipline. With patience. With a dog who refused to leave his side. And a daughter who refused to let him disappear. That evening, as dusk settled over the mountains once more, Emily sat at the table drawing a picture of the cabin. Atlas lay under the table, tail brushing lightly against her boots. Daniel stood at the window again, but not scanning for threats, not bracing for impact, just watching light fade from the peaks. He thought about the day in Cheyenne when the gavel struck wood and silence swallowed him whole. He thought about the night Atlas scratched at the floor. He thought about the storm that nearly took him, and the sheriff who said, "This isn't a broken man." Daniel finally understood something simple. Strength wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't proven in a single moment. It was built in small, quiet choices. Stay, breathe, repair, protect, rebuild. Emily looked up from her drawing. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Can we plant something in the spring? Like a tree?" Daniel smiled slowly. "Yeah," he said. "We can." She nodded with satisfaction and returned to her picture. Atlas rose and walked over to Daniel, pressing gently against his leg. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's head. "You did your job," he murmured. Atlas blinked slowly, steady as ever. Outside, the mountains darkened under the coming night. Inside, the fire crackled back to life. Daniel Mercer did not feel like a man who had won. He felt like a man who had stayed. And sometimes, staying is the bravest thing a soldier can do. The cabin stood. The mountains stood. And so did he. Not hiding. Not running. Home. If this story meant something to you, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever had a storm in your life that nearly broke you, but you chose to stay instead of run? If your answer is yes, just comment 1 below. If you're still fighting your storm right now, comment 0, and know you're not alone. And if Atlas reminded you that loyalty still exists in this world, drop a paw in the comments so we know you felt it too. Your comments don't just support this channel. They build a community of people who understand resilience, family, and second chances. If you want more stories like this, stories about strength, redemption, and the quiet kind of courage that doesn't make headlines, make sure you subscribe. There are more mountains ahead, more storms, more stories waiting to be told, and we'll face them together. I'll see you in the next one.